So on that note, I would like to welcome Meredith Blay to the stage, please. Meredith is the Manager for Policy and Research at Volunteering WA. With qualifications in commerce and governance, her focus is to advocate to governments for legislative and policy settings that support volunteers and programs. Her current areas of focus include the development of a State of Volunteering report for WA and a campaign to reduce the administrative and financial burden of volunteer screening. She previously led the development of the State Water Plan for the WA State Government and Water Forever, a 50-year plan for Perth's water future. In her spare time, Meredith grows veggies, hikes, paints, and of course, volunteers herself. Thanks, Meredith.
Good morning, everyone. So lovely to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I never in my wildest dreams thought that I would displace the Yukon vet as a speaker, so that's I'll have to add that to my resume, but hopefully I'll live up to it. Just before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the country on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We are of course meeting on Whadjuk Noongar country in our first spring of Dilja, and it's a real privilege to be meeting with you today in this beautiful country. I'll talk a little bit about volunteering, but before I do, I'd just like to get a read of the room. I'm just wondering how many of your organisations rely on volunteers for delivery of your services? If you could show hands, okay. And how many of you feel you have enough volunteers from everything from sort of, you know, back office work, governance? Okay, anyone replete with volunteers? No, okay. So what we'll do today in the presentation, there will be a lot of graphs and slides, but I'll really talk to you about, I guess, the stories that are happening behind. So what we want to talk about is the changing landscape of volunteering in Australia, and a lot of the trends are very consistent across state and territories. And to really understand what that might mean for your programs and how you can redesign them, and also most importantly, the support that is available to you in the course of doing that. So Volunteering WA is a peak body for volunteering, and there is one in every state and territory across Australia, which I hope you're aware. We obviously do a lot of work with government at all levels, the Australian government, state governments, as well as local governments, to promote volunteering, to look at the legislative settings, the policy settings, to make sure volunteers are recognised and appreciated. And we think that there is still some way to go beyond, I guess, pats on the back and photo opportunities to do that. Volunteers really are the lifeblood of our communities, and it was really inspiring for me to hear Dean's address today. What a guy, hey? It really does make you stop and think about the absolute importance of wildlife and wildlife volunteering, I guess, to our whole ecosystem, our whole society and environment. And I just would like to acknowledge my thanks to you for the very important work that you do. One of the things that we have worked hard for is to get support from the Australian government, and they really have come to the party nationally. So I just want to let you know that there is a huge amount of resources available now. One of their focus has been to put, I guess, to get more standardised resources across Australia, and also to put them online just to make them more accessible for everyone, including in regional areas and including people that can't necessarily show up to a face-to-face presentation at a given point in time. And there's a numerous number of training courses, networks, etc., that are completely free. So if you're looking for support, please go to your peak volunteering body in your area. In WA, for example, we run a free service called Volunteer Organisation Help. So you can contact us at any point on any matter, and we will, I guess, give support. Sometimes it's quite simple about giving examples of, you know, policies or approaches or volunteer agreements or whatever that might have been used elsewhere. And sometimes it's just coaching through a situation, and it can include quite structured training all the way through to certificate 4-level courses for volunteer management. So we also support, we have about 800 members that are also part of our membership. And we, from WA, we also run the national IT recruitment platforms for all volunteer positions. So on any given day in Australia, there'll be 12,000 positions on average advertised through there. It's still one of the very highest rates after word of mouth. Online recruitment is the highest form that people respond to. It's a free service, and it reaches over 2 million Australians every year in terms of finding a position that suits them. So also be aware of that. I would like to recognise the National Strategy for Volunteering. So that has been put in place and released this year by Volunteering Australia. It was really a co-design process across Australia. One of the very important things that this does is set up a decade-long roadmap, I guess, for volunteering, trying to, I guess, address the crisis in volunteering that we are seeing. So it is a practical way forward. The development of strategy was supported by the Australian government, which we think is fantastic, and it's in its early stages of implementation. One of the first things that we've been successful at doing is in the federal budget process. So it previously was all designed around, GDPs and interest rates and those sort of measures of success. But there's now a list of measures called Measuring What Matters, which are really about the well-being of Australia as a nation. And we were successful at getting volunteering participation recognised in there, both for the services that it provides to the community, but also for the individual benefits that it brings to personal connection, well-being and social cohesion. So just looking at the numbers, what's actually happening with formal volunteering in Australia? So there's about 5 million Australians formally volunteer, and they're people over 15. And by formal volunteering, I mean people that actually belong to an organisation or an association that is incorporated in some way, shape or form. So that is a fairly strong number. But unfortunately, what we can see is that the rate of volunteering has dropped quite sharply since 2010. And in fact, that decline was evident before COVID. So by 2019, it was quite accentuated, and COVID has obviously just made that situation significantly worse. So we've gone from about 1 in 3 people in Australia participating formally in volunteering to about 1 in 4 in the space of less than a decade. That's actually quite a significant shift in society. So if you're struggling, you are not alone, and there's things that we can do about that. So I'll just give you a snapshot about what that looks like in West Australia. As I said, if you look at any of the states and territories, the situation is fairly consistent, so you can really translate this. But in West Australia, just to give you a feel, we now have about 1 in 4 volunteering, down to 523,000 volunteers. That's actually a loss of 150,000 volunteers, which is a lot of people that no longer volunteer. So that's a lot of skills and knowledge that aren't being applied in the community, a lot of benefits that are not being realised by the community, and there's a lot of loss of social connection and well-being as a result of that. So it's a significant fall, and governments are aware of this. I think one of the interesting things is when we look at where that decline actually happened, a lot of it actually happened with women. So women, actually, the rate of decline was most sharp for women, and they now volunteer, not that you'd know it from this room perhaps, but they now volunteer at a similar rate to men as a general rule. So some of that obviously is societal changes, but I think, and there's possibly a necessary rebalance, but it's something to think about. So a lot of volunteer programs think about how you might appeal to different genders, different identities, and think about that so that you can be more inclusive, but also there are opportunities really to boost your volunteer numbers. So when we look at what that means for the hours of formal volunteering across Australia, it's really significant. There's been a loss of 250 odd million hours a year of volunteer time since 2014, so in 6 short years. And just in terms of the replacement cost of that labour, that's about $12 billion a year loss in capacity. So the opportunity today, as I go through some of the changes, is to really think about what are some of the cohorts, what holds true for your organisation, what are some of the cohorts that you might be able to appeal to address that, but also to be aware of those changes. So another significant change is the number of organisations. So people used to typically volunteer for at least 2 and probably more like 3 organisations. Increasingly now that is 1, and that has been a very steady trend for a long period of time. So people are choosing, I guess, the volunteer experience that best reflects their personal situations, their interest, where they feel comfortable and where they feel that they can make the most contribution. So there is some, I guess, competition, if you like, between volunteer roles, that people are making those evaluations about where they actually want to put their time. And now we're seeing that most people, 2/3 of people, only volunteer for one organisation. As I said, that proportion is growing, with people dropping out of multiple volunteering roles. One of the areas we see this most acutely is in regional areas, where the risk of burnout is, of course, extremely high. Regional people have a very high level of volunteering, generally speaking, but it is declining quite rapidly, and they're just exhausted, I think, and they're looking for more support. One of the positive changes has been the rise in digital volunteering. So what this graph is showing is that most people volunteer in person in some way, shape or form over the course of a year in a physical sense. So they'll rock up to a meeting or to an induction or an orientation or a celebration, a board meeting, whatever it might be. But in addition to that, we're finding that about 1/4 of all volunteers also do some online volunteering. And this really is opening up lots of opportunities. So it's opening up intra and inter-regional and interstate opportunities to attract volunteers, and that's been very successful, where people have targeted that. People in regional areas are actually able to contribute at advocacy and campaigning levels, more at state and national levels, because of that opportunity. People with disability might be able to contribute through database role, governance roles, bring all of their skills to the table. So there's a huge opportunity to look at the infrastructure that supports, I guess, your organisation's online capacity, and see what you can do for that. There are volunteer grants available nationally every year for $5,000 per organisation, and they can include a significant investment in online capacity, training, resources, things of that nature that can enable volunteer inclusion. So another area I just want to touch on is the difference between formal and informal volunteering. So informal volunteering is what we call mutual aid or kind of self-help. So they might be like local Facebook groups, so things of that nature. So they might be in times of emergencies, but also day to day, where people are just connecting locally. People don't want to identify as being a volunteer for this particular organisation, having some ongoing commitment, but they're quite happy to support a call out for different things. It might be skills, it might be busy bees, might be whatever that could be, cooking for something, caring for wildlife, obviously, but not in a formal sense. And the rate of informal volunteering is consistently higher than the rate of formal volunteering. So more people are helping people outside of their immediate household and family in that way. So, and that is quite strong. And we're finding particularly that with a generational change, people are more comfortable with volunteering in kind of local settings, in sort of grassroots organisations, if you know what I mean. They don't even necessarily look like organisations. So think about the opportunities to harness those informal volunteers. Some very large formal organisations, volunteering organisations, Red Cross is one that comes to mind, they actually mask some of their activities looking like the grassroots activities, because people are more likely to participate in them than they would if they said it was a Red Cross opportunity. So they just make it look like, come along and give us a hand for 2 hours or 4 hours or whatever it might be, and they're getting a better uptake than if they advertised it as a more formal role. So something to think about there. There was I guess that's looking at the rates across Australia, so you can see the rate is higher. There was an impact due to COVID, we think, in 2020, where most states and territories, oddly enough, reported a decline in the rate of informal volunteering, except for New South Wales and Queensland, where there was a slight increase. We're not really quite sure what caused that. We're thinking it's just sort of that retreat, the cocooning that was happening at home, and possibly due to the lockdowns and the exclusions, I guess the mandatory vaccinations, those sorts of policies, particularly if you weren't recognised as an essential service and having access to that or having those opportunities. They're the sorts of things that can that really did make an impact on people volunteering. So in WA, and I'm sure this largely holds true for most other states and territories, you're more likely to volunteer if you live in a regional area, if you're born in Australia with higher household incomes, if you're part-time employed. So part-time employed actually have higher rates of volunteering than full employment or people with no employment, with higher levels of education. Oddly enough, people with dependent children. So if you want something to be done, give it to a busy person, I guess, where parents volunteered. So that tradition of starting volunteering as part of your way of life is really important and something that we'd really like to build into communities. And when they played sport or participated in a youth group or an arts or cultural organisation as a child. So it really starts early. One of the things that we're doing in volunteering WA, and it's also been done extensively in New South Wales, and I'm sure others, is really working on youth programs about how to connect that. What we find is that the youth are available, but a lot of the organisations don't really cater for youth. They either don't have people with the skills, or the nature of the opportunities are different. So a lot of it is actually working with organisations to design programs that appeal to youth. And again, if you can get them early, they're more likely to continue. And they'll do that for a whole host of reasons. Some of it, of course, is to give back. Some of it is just to do things with friends, so that we find that with youth, if they can do things as a group or as a, bring their buddies or their mates along, they're more likely to do that school group. And some of it is for resume development, skill development, or to sort of test out vocational options that they might be thinking about. And they're all good. So I guess one of the other things, and some of the stats I'll go through now, is really about diversity. And it's one of the things, that list of what you saw where volunteering is more likely, I guess that's really a historical lens. And what we'd like to see going forward is that everybody in Australia equally has an opportunity to volunteer in causes and in ways that are meaningful to them and give them value and provide value to the community. So it can be incredibly powerful when it reflects communities. In terms of funding, we find that there is more funding opportunities in those areas. So if you're looking for funding opportunities, sometimes involving people through minority groups can be a way to access that. And it's really about creating spaces that make people feel welcome and included, and an opportunity for them to, I guess, bring their skills and talents. So I guess one of the myths about volunteering is that only old people volunteer. We hear that all the time, all the time. And it's actually, I guess it's declining. So the rate of people volunteering over 70 is dropping fairly significantly, but we're seeing more volunteering actually happening, particularly in sort of those middle ages. And as you can see, the dominant group that volunteer are sort of the busy sort of middle-aged group of between 40 and 54. There's a huge opportunity to connect with people between about 25 and 30, and again, to build those connections and that pattern, and that being part of their life, really, and how they make their friendships and spend their time. All of the data that I'm presenting today, almost all the data, is gathered from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And one of the things that they did in 2020 was, for the first time, ask the question about what impact health conditions and disability had on volunteering rates. And one of the things they found was that there was very little different with people that self-reported a chronic health condition or having a disability. They actually volunteered at almost exactly the same rate as everybody else in the community. So, and in some cases more. So I think, think about the lens that you put through things. One of the things we often talk about is having that conversation with volunteers about, are there any accommodations that we could make that would make it easier for you to participate, for you to give more for you to continue your role. So think about those accommodations, but certainly be aware that those people are ready, willing and able to contribute. The ones that are least likely are people with a mental health condition, and that is their self-reporting. So I'm not sure of the causation there, whether or not the lack of volunteering leads to the mental health or vice versa. But certainly there might be people in your programs that at time to time give them the option of having a pause. We often find that people sort of hit the wall for a while. We sometimes say to organisations, why don't you ask them if they just want to take a break for the summer, or they want to take a break for a year, and you check in with them, see how they're going. And oftentimes we find that people really welcome that opportunity to be contacted again at a time that they're willing to participate, and they really appreciate, I guess, the loyalty that organisations show them in that regard. Another one that the ABS looked at was about sexual orientation, and again, it made no difference to the rate of volunteering in the community, so equal levels. So when we look at why Australians volunteer, the number one reason consistently is to help the community, and then the second one is personal satisfaction. So that's that sort of interchange of joy, I guess, that you get by giving to the community and feeling that sense of satisfaction about the contribution that you've made. As I said, personal and family involvement are really strong. So they're very strong ties that keep people volunteering. So always look at family opportunities. If you've already got people volunteering in your programs, maybe have invite a family member a day, and you're more likely to get volunteers from that cohort quite significantly. So could be extended family, real opportunities. So where there's already a connection, those bonds are stronger, and those volunteers tend to keep going in those roles for longer as well. And a big issue is, and this started from 2020. So believe it or not, at that time, everyone was worried about plummeting employment rates. Everyone was worried about how we're going to keep people involved. We've now come full circle. We've almost got full employment, but nonetheless, there's a lot of skill development. So people are building resumes, or they've already got existing skills that they want to use. They feel they're underutilized in their existing area, or perhaps they've retired or semi-retired. So there's a lot of sort of using those skills. So think about volunteering roles. We say that all volunteers are skilled. They are all skilled, but roles have different degrees of skills. And sometimes people with skills may say, look, I just want a Joe job. I just want something where I can rock up, not think about it. So don't give all that responsibility back on me. I'm not looking for it, but I'm happy to contribute. Conversely, other people are very happy to contribute those skills. So it's really about keeping that dialogue open about what's motivating people. The biggest barriers to volunteering consistently are family and work commitments. So again, we find that people are more likely to do something as a one-off or an episodic sort of volunteering rather than a regular commitment. That tends to scare people away. And the other one is the cost of volunteering. So certainly where people have to travel, transport costs have become expensive. And reimbursement, I guess, is hard to come by in volunteering. So we know that only about 15% of volunteers get reimbursed at all for any of their volunteer expenses. So there's a lot of volunteers actually spending their own money to volunteer. One of the, I guess, campaigns we have going with the state government in WA is to remove the cost of volunteer screening for working with children, NDIS checks, which are free in just about every other state and territory other than WA. And volunteer police checks, shout out to South Australia. So they're the only state that actually make those free for volunteers. And in WA, there's a cost for those, as there is in most other states. But it's not just paying the money, it's then the hassle of putting in a reimbursement. The organisation's got to process the reimbursement, got to get the money back, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole bunch of administration that goes with that we'd like to see gone. There's a lot of information on this slide, but I just really want to talk about the impact of COVID-19. So I guess there were really three major impacts. The first one is that there were a lot of organisations, and we heard that earlier from Dean, that had huge financial imposts on them, and an inability to fundraise, other sources of funding stop. So a lot of organisations have either stopped completely, scaled back significantly, or are still on hold. So that's one of the big changes. Significant loss of volunteers, so it might have accelerated volunteer attrition. In aged care, for example, I was talking to an aged care home last week. They lost 90% of their volunteers in COVID, and they've only recovered 20% of them now. So huge changes, and people are struggling to recover. The one glimmer of hope in all of that is that ANU did some research that looked at people's, I guess, what they reported as their levels of psychological distress, and people that continued volunteering, including through the pandemic, reported significantly lower levels of psychological distress. So again, that wellbeing message is important. So I guess summarising all of that, cause for concern, there's a decline in formal volunteers, female volunteers, fewer hours, fewer organisations, and COVID-19 impacts continue to today. But there's a lot of hope for optimism, or reason for optimism. There's a rise in informal volunteering, there's an increase in virtual or online volunteering, increased motivations to use skills, much greater inclusion and accessibility. I've noticed that changed in the sector just in the last 4 years, significant changes, which I think are benefiting everyone, and the value of personal sense and wellbeing remains very strong. So when we look at designing roles for different volunteers, we encourage organisations to have a range to move beyond just sort of the traditional. So think about formal and informal structural options, on-site virtual options, regular volunteering options, but episodic, those kind of just one-off events that people might turn to, what their aspiration is, and they're all good, whether it's for community development, build their resume, social connection, whatever it might be, make all of those reasons feel welcome, and think about the different avenues. So you can, for example, through the online platform, it's a really good way of attracting skilled volunteers. So for things like campaigning, advocacy, governance functions, people might want to participate on the ground. Mutual aid, they're those sort of informal grassroots organisations. As a leisure activity, there's a huge opportunity to turn into, people will, for tourism, tourists will volunteer for anything. It's actually quite interesting. So tourist caravan parks, great source of volunteers, and also to provide service. Just want to end on a report that was done by Victoria. So this is from the Environmental Volunteering Social Research Report that was published in 2020. And it looked specifically at how to increase participation in environmental volunteering. And for that, I'm extending that to animal welfare. But I guess the first thing they said was to plant the seed. So it looked at an evidence-based approach. So to really let people know what the need is. So a lot of people, and we hear that consistently, we didn't know that there was a need. If people hear what the need is and that's articulated in a way that's meaningful to them, they're much more likely to respond. And make it clear, like it seems obvious to us, but just say, we need more volunteers. In WA last year, Lifeline was short of volunteers. I don't know if everybody knows, but crisis help is largely sourced by volunteers across Australia. 60,000 volunteers work in crisis support every day in Australia. When that call went out from Lifeline WA, it was the first time they've ever had to do that. They've always had an abundance of people sort of waiting in the wings. They had to say to people, they put it out and people said, why didn't you tell us? We didn't know. They had 1,000 applications in the space of a week. So let people know that you need volunteers. I guess the first one is allay the commitment anxiety, lots of little roles before you're asking people to commit to 40 hours a week or whatever it might be. Fly the flag, so let people know what the opportunity is, promote it, promote people coming along, share the benefits that are happening. Refresh your image, so think about the target cohorts. You might want to target different messages for different cohorts. Get organised, so invest in online portals, invest in technology to actually support the volunteer management, but also making those roles available. Engage the sector, so there's a lot of connection upstream and downstream, including with governments, local governments that are welcome to help. So really about getting that whole network working. And then we do find that organised testing volunteer opportunities is incredibly important at a small scale, getting the bugs out before you can then go ahead and and apply it on a larger scale. That's an excellent report if anyone is interested in that. So that concludes my presentation for today. I think there might be time for questions. I'll let Dean tell you.
Look, Meredith, thank you very much. I think and we all rely on volunteers. So that was really insightful. We've probably got time for 2 questions. So there are a couple of microphones here. Would anyone like to ask Meredith a question? Raise your hand and maybe you can wander up. Oh, no one wants to show any love. Beautiful. Yeah, come on up. Thank you. If everyone just, around the mics, just maybe clear a little bit of space would be wonderful.
Do you know why there's been a decrease in the female volunteers?
We're not entirely sure. It's a really good question why there's been a decrease in female volunteers. There has been an increase in workforce participation to some extent, but not to the degree that that is showing, because that's been happening for a long time. I think it's just burnout. I think just people are tired. That's what we're hearing from people, and just a bit of evening, I guess, of roles, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, that's what we're hearing mainly.
Thank you.
I'm just curious about the data post 2020. I'm a bit short, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, the data post 2020, is the trend still declining?
Yeah, so I guess what's happening, why is that data 2020? So the Australian Bureau of Statistics has always collected all the volunteering data. I guess because of COVID, it's been collected through a thing called the General Social Survey, but they haven't collected it since 2020. So there's a lot of advocacy happening at the moment, and actually the Minister for the ABS is the same minister, coincidentally, for charities at the moment and the not-for-profit sector. So yeah, we met with him just a couple of weeks ago. So we're advocating strongly for the collection of the data. The report that I'm working on, most states and territories are working on one at the moment, I guess, to supplement that at a state and territory level. So a state of volunteering report, but it's because we haven't got any data since then, but we're dying to know.
Will you just give Meredith a round of applause, please? Look, this year we're trying our very best to be as sustainable as we can, so all the gifts are sort of sustainably sourced. And thank you very much, Meredith, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.